All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, January 16th, and looks like we dodged a bullet with Iran. We
Well,
were,
yeah, for the time being. Yeah, as we speak, there's a carrier task group that is heading, steaming towards Iran from the South China Sea. There's the USS Abraham Lincoln, an aircraft carrier, and its accompanying fleet is heading towards Iran right as we speak. And then there's also, according to the New York Times, there are plans, which may have already begun, to be implemented to deploy more assets in the regions, ground forces, and but especially aircraft, including refueling tankers. So it certainly sounds like attack on Iran is not off the table. Maybe it was only just delayed. It looked like, actually after our last episode, it looked like their attack was imminent, and there were all kinds of signs of it. Iranian airspace was closed down. Embassies were being evacuated in Iran and in Israel. And then we heard from Trump that, they called off the executions, and maybe we don't need to do this now. And then in the New York Times, we learned that, or it wasn't just the New York Times, but in different media outlets, that apparently Trump decided not to go ahead with the attack, which apparently was imminent, because his advisors couldn't guarantee that it would be successful, that it would lead to regime change. Now, why is that? Why did he think it might be successful? I think it is these protests. That was the plan. And, he was actively encouraging them, telling them to take over institutions, help's on the way. And then we've spoken about some of these other comments made by, Mike Pompeo and Israeli officials, openly stating their support. And I was trying to figure out why they would do that. And I provided one theory that might be, maybe is the explanation, that they just kind of become so kind of reckless and overconfident that they don't even bother to hide, the secret hand anymore. They've come to believe in their own propaganda. Another side of that, I guess, is not really opposed to that theory, but it's just that, they were pushing hard for regime change. And so this was a message, by stating it out loud, they were both encouraging the protesters, with whom they may have been having difficulties communicating because of the Starlink and other shutdowns in Iran, and also letting the Iranian authorities know, Mossad's right there, giving them a reason to crack down. They just wanted the violence to increase, and they saw it as really the first step towards regime change. But it seems like Iran has successfully suppressed this insurrection, because that's what it was turning into. And so anyway, now that the streets were calm, whatever it was that the Americans had planned, or the Americans and the Israelis had planned, clearly was not going to work. I don't think it would work anyway, but it wasn't going to work. So now maybe they're going to plan B. Again, there are more. The USS Abraham Lincoln is steaming that way, and other assets are being deployed in the region, and we'll have to see. But I have to say that it really is a blow to this whole regime change operation. This is a kind of, we saw what they did with Operation Rising Lion, and they can't do it again. Not for a long, long time, because those assets have been arrested, and the Iranians are aware of that, and so they're going to. It's not going to be a surprise again. You can only carry out a surprise attack once, right, of any kind of nature. And then this is something else. This was obviously a different kind of plan, and it's failed. So I don't know. Do they have another plan? Why are they so dead set on doing this now when they don't really seem to have laid the necessary groundwork?
Yeah, that was what I was going to say. I'm surprised that you're saying that it seems like assets are still moving in the region, preparing for an attack when it seems like the window of opportunity has already passed. There was this fever pitch of momentum. We saw the coordinated propaganda push on social media and mainstream news, gearing everybody up for this imminent attack, that we just got to save these protesters that are being slaughtered. And then it seems like a big part of it was that they shut down Starlink, and then the communication between, I guess, Mossad, CIA to these protesters just went down, and it fizzled out. So if they've expended all their regime change capital, can they do it again? What is Plan C? Because Plan A was the big one, Operation Rising Lion. We talked about they couldn't do this again. What can they do next time? And what we've seen here is kind of the more traditional regime change operation, economic sanctions. Get people to suffer and then start to feed into that anger that people are upset with their government because the economy's not doing good, because we're strangling them economically. And then you can start to build up this resentment and find people and funnel things in to have some type of revolution, and then do exactly what Trump was saying, like take over, we rise up people, and then we can come in and kind of push it over. It didn't work.
Right.
What can they do now?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they really have another, card up their sleeve. It's and it is interesting that they're pushing for this again. I think that basic problem that we were talking about, the lack of air defense interceptors, that has not been solved. There's just no way that they could have solved it in the few months after the 12-day war. Because again, the production capacity of both the U.S. and Israel are just very, very limited. It takes them years and years and years to build up a stockpile, a substantial stockpile that could last them some significant number of weeks, and they don't have that capacity. So why is it? Well, I think one possibility, and I know that we've discussed this earlier, is that they're looking at. They see this. Okay, they know it's risky. But they think that the next, let's say, few months, several months, I don't know, may be their last chance, because the Russians and the Chinese are there. Iran has finally just accepted help from them and is building up its air defenses. Now, this is a long process. Let's say it's started in the summer of last year. It's still in its really initial stages, because it takes years to get a really proper countrywide air defense system set up. But in the meantime, you can have, it does whatever they've given, provided, supplied to the Iranians is going to be helpful. It's not going to be foolproof. There's not, well, no air defense system is foolproof. Missiles always a missile or two will occasionally get through. That's just going to happen even with the best air defense system. But, there will be big holes in it, but they will have the capacity to shoot down some planes. And that does change things already. And as that progresses, that risk becomes even greater. Maybe those B-2s went in and out because, there are different theories. Maybe it was something that was actually prearranged between the Iranians and the Americans. That's not impossible. They've done similar things. But it may be that they really didn't have sufficient air defenses. But now they do. And now if you're going to do a B-2 run, or at least, let's say, couple of months from now, there's a really high chance that an S-400 or something will take it down. And that's what they're looking at. And I think so they see it as a race against time. Now, again, it's very reckless to launch an attack, in the current circumstances, but it'll just be impossible after a certain period of time.
Yeah, well, it seems like no matter if you do an attack, you yourself don't have the air defenses. So it's insanity. It's suicide, but they're dead set on this. But
yeah.
So you think that it's likely that this was just a small pause, and now Plan C is to overwhelming military strength, pumping all these assets into the region?
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Again, earlier we were talking about Trump and how maybe there's a part of his brain that still, has a real firm grip on reality. And I think maybe we saw that. It was just like, okay, we were worried that he had the God Emperor complex, which I think he does, but that might override everything, right? Maybe it didn't. He actually listened to those advisors that said, look, this probably will fail. And then we got a real mess on our hands. And he said, okay, yeah, I don't want that. He likes those really, in and out, just a one-off kind of operation. That's what he wants to do. That's what he did with Midnight Hammer. That's what he did with Absolute Resolve, right? And he wants to do something. Now, of course, you can't do that. You can't overthrow a well-established government like the Iranian government, with a single strike. You maybe take out the supreme leader, but that doesn't mean there are many. This is a government that's composed of many different institutions and different, interlocking institutions, and has broad support among the people. Of course, I know there are people there who oppose it, but clearly it does have broad support. And yeah, just a single decapitation strike, even if successful, is not going to do it. So I don't know what they're really thinking, but the pressure to do it is still there. One thing that I'm really struck by is, let's just go back a year and remember how all the talk was about the nuclear program. And it's just like their so-called nuclear weapons program, which didn't exist. Well, we've got to do it. We only have 2 months. They're going to have a bomb. We've been hearing this for years and years, for even decades, right? And this was always the rationale for attacking Iran. And they did it. And now it's like, okay, well, you took out according to Trump, it's been obliterated. He's used that word probably 100 times, if not 1,000. So we're not talking about the nuclear weapons program anymore. It's just they can't have missiles. It's just the bar has gone way down. This is one of the problems. It's like we see this happening under Trump. It's just like these thresholds are being lowered. These taboos are being broken. When you go ahead and actually attack Iran, then the second time becomes easier in a way. It's just like you've already said, this is something we do. We attack other countries, we attack Iran, we kidnap presidents. It just, people get used to it. It almost starts to seem normal. I mean, it even happens to me. It's just like you should be utterly shocked by all this. And if you took somebody from the not so distant past and showed them what was happening, that person would be utterly shocked. This can't be. But now we're starting to expect these things. So anyway, they didn't really work all that hard. I mean, they did make some effort, but they didn't work all that hard to justify an attack. They just don't feel like they need to anymore.
Yeah. Well, the narrative that they pushed out was really just about these protesters. It's strange that we went from, they have nuclear, they're going to get nuclear weapons, we got to attack them right now, to like, we need to save people protesting, and right. We're humanitarians now. Wow, everyone's like, really? After we are complicit in a genocide in Gaza. Yeah, that's the situation of the United States right now. Yeah. And now we're bleeding heart humanitarians. Like, it is strange. Well, one thing that makes me feel like we are a bit in the clear is I saw a video clip of Lindsey Graham, and I've never seen him so sad in my life. So I want to show it to you, and just maybe that will make you feel better, that maybe Trump has just realized that, hey, we can't do this.
There are a lot of headlines out there that are, in my view, not accurate. President Trump's resolve is not the question. The question is, when we do an operation like this, should it be bigger or smaller? I'm in the camp of bigger. Time will tell. I'm hopeful and optimistic that the regime days are numbered.
Have you seen him so sad before?
Yeah.
He doesn't feel confident.
No, he said, I'm hopeful and optimistic. He didn't sound very hopeful or optimistic. Yeah. There's that pizza index that people use, like the Pentagon's, ordering pizza or whatever. Maybe we should have a Lindsey Graham index, just a picture of his face and facial expressions. And that does give me a little bit of hope.
The more excited Lindsey Graham is, then that's when I get worried, because you saw how giddy he was after Venezuela, and he's just like, yes, it's like he couldn't contain his excitement.
Yeah, just like a little girl, I remember.
Yeah. So, how is it? What is his mentality? It's just all about his happiness is just tied to war and conflict. How is that even possible that somebody can be like that? That this is all they care about is just war.
Yeah.
Just going to war.
Yeah. Well, Many of us, yourself included, have grown up hearing these war stories. The great exploits of our forefathers, and the heroes that came before us, and all those things really excite the imagination, and it can lead to just sort of a love of war, without a lack of reflection on whether the war is justified, right? And I think you see it in Lindsey Graham. There's one thing, too. I think all, politicians, especially when domestic conditions are particularly grim or difficult to, domestic problems are difficult to solve, they find this, the foreign policy, and particularly, the U.S. of the military, the use of the U.S. military as an outlet. This is a place where I can express myself, I can do something, I can perform great deeds. And I think it's not just true of the Americans, but it's also true, very much true of the European leaders, Macron and for example, and Keir Starmer. They are faced with intractable domestic problems. They're having no luck, in solving them. Their people are angry at them, but they can, in their minds anyway, they can imagine achieving great things, out in the battlefield. Maybe not the literal battlefield, but kind of a figurative battlefield, opposing the enemy, whether it's Russia or it's Iran or, whatever. I mean, there is always that temptation. Yeah.
But they don't have military, so they.
Yeah, I know. So it's very silly, right?
they want us to do it, is what it is, because it's that's the frustrating thing.
Oh no, but I heard there actually are sending military forces to Greenland.
Okay, yeah, we'll get into that soon.
Yeah, the Swedes sent 3, I think, and the Brits 1. And then
wait, you mean like 3 units?
Military personnel, 3 individuals.
3 people.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Uh-oh. All right, so it's heating up over there. Okay, well, we'll move up to the north soon, but just one more thing about Iran. If Israel and the U.S. are really dead set on this, and it just seems clear that no matter what, they failed, but they're just going to try again. They're just a broken record. Why doesn't Iran strike first? If they know this is coming, I think they have enough evidence and global support, I think, on their side now.
Right.
After what we've been witnessing in Gaza for over 2 years, and just we did a sucker punch attack on them in the middle of negotiations.
Right.
So it's not like it's coming out of the blue.
Right.
It's recent enough in history that I think people would understand. Oh yeah, this was something's going on over here, and Iran should have the right to strike.
Right. Well, I think much of the world would understand. Of course, it would be played up as naked, unprovoked aggression in the West, and you'd be surprised. Again, I mean, I do make a point of reading mainstream news sources, and again, Haaretz and these other news sites, and they inhabit a completely different mental space, in which. Yeah, Israel is just a poor little victim, and the U.S., though we may have some issues with Trump, basically is a force for good that is trying to keep these, teach these brutal regimes a lesson. That's the world that they live in, and it will be described as unprovoked, brutal aggression, by the Iranians. Now, I guess if I were the leader of Iran, I would say, well, it doesn't matter. No matter what, they're going to paint us this way. So, maybe we just need to go ahead and do that. But Pezeshkian seems to be not the man to do it. In the end, it may not even be his decision. It may be that the supreme leader, if he actually insists on it, and with the IRGC supporting him, it could happen. I think Pezeshkian himself would be reluctant to. He's proved to be cautious, and again, really not, I think, the leader for a country in wartime.
Yeah, I think if Iran, the way to do it would be to adopt the moral position, to say to Israel, says, look, you need to pull out of Gaza. You need to stop this madness that we've all been seeing. You need to pull out of Lebanon. You need to stop the destruction of the West Bank. You need to pull out of Syria. And then if they say this, then the whole world will be like, yes, please, we don't want to see this suffering and bloodshed just stream to us on our phone constantly, and nobody does a damn thing about it.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, people are like, yes, please. And then this gives them the impetus, because we know that Israel won't do that. And then we can't just say that, oh, it just came out of blue as a sneak attack, the way that they're going to paint it unprovoked. It's like Iran stated its stance. And it's the stance that the whole world wants to hear, to say, stop this madness, Israel. Stop slaughtering women and children in Gaza.
Yeah.
Stop taking land in the West Bank and in Syria and Lebanon, bombing countries constantly.
Right.
And I think people would get behind it. And then,
well, you may be right. You may be right. And, maybe if Raisi was still the president there, maybe that's what they would be doing. But I just don't think Pezeshkian is the man to do it.
do you think that was that helicopter that went down? Do you think that was just a mechanical failure, or I don't know. I just don't. Everything I've seen Israel do, I just feel like.
Yeah. Well, I when it happened, and again, the Iranian government has reported that they have stated very clearly that it was a mechanical failure, and they haven't changed their position. I took that, explanation as the truth. I guess after Operation Rising Lion, I began to have second thoughts, because you saw the degree of penetration of Iranian society. And so it just said, well, if they could do that, they could have got to some mechanic or whatever, and that worked on that helicopter. Now, I don't think they couldn't have had, I don't think, the foresight that okay, Raisi is gone, it's going to be Pezeshkian. But maybe they knew enough to say he's likely to be the replacement, and we think that he's going to be easier to deal with. So it could have happened. I mean, it really could have. I have to, actually, helicopters sometimes do crash. There was a helicopter crash not too far from where we used to live. These things do happen. Helicopters are actually, they're not like airplanes. When something goes wrong, they just drop like a rock, and maybe that's what happened. But I just have to be suspicious. Again, especially after Operation Rising Lion, I became very suspicious.
Yeah, well, and also we just know that the Israelis in the United States, they don't really think much beyond after they kill a leader. Their idea is just we do these decapitation strikes. Look, we kidnapped Maduro, but we left the government in power. Israel killed Nasrallah, the Yemen leadership as well, Khania. That's their modus operandi. Is just keep on going after the top, and hopefully it sows chaos down below.
Yeah. Good point.
So I don't know if they really think we'll get Pezeshkian in and he's better. It's just wow, we just love killing the leaders.
Yeah, and I think probably they also recognize that Raisi was a formidable opponent. Somebody who, that they to some extent respected. Because they feared him. They understood that he, would. That he unified Iran and would be certain to provide forceful responses.
Are you kind of surprised that there aren't any countries that are just clearly speaking up for the Palestinians? Because just seeing the rhetoric coming from Europe and the United States during the so-called, to protect these so-called protesters, which were really insurrectionists that were funded by the CIA, Mossad, everybody went along with it and said this is a justification for military intervention. But meanwhile, we've just watched Gaza completely leveled. You just see the footage of it. These people don't have homes to live in. They have nothing, and they're being shot at and slaughtered every day.
Right.
And nobody in the world says anything. Even Iran isn't vocal about it. When they talk about
they do make statements. They don't get reported in our press. I think Iran has always been very, very clear about it, and it has been unequivocal in its support for the Palestinians and unequivocal in its condemnation of Zionism. That's one reason why the Israelis hate them so much. Now, a lot of people think that under Pezeshkian, they have failed to back up their words with action, that they should have provided more support to Hezbollah, for example, and maybe more support to the Houthis in Yemen. Again, that's another thing, a consequence of the loss of Raisi. But they, as far as the words go, I think they have always been unequivocal in, their stance pro-Palestine and anti-Zionism.
Yeah, it's just amazing to me because, I've heard other pundits, I think it was Mark Sloboda, which is saying, yeah, well, it's sorry to say, but the Gazans are just doomed. And that's a tough pill to swallow.
It is, yeah.
Just think that they're just doomed, that no one's going to come to help them. Because Trump is saying help is on the way for these insurgents. We're going to bomb this country, and no country can even like just economic sanctions. Just stop trade with Israel. Stop cut off ties. Like we were not saying there's no. I just don't understand how every country in the world, other than Yemen, really go Houthis. Nobody else is really doing anything. Everyone just kind of ignores it and says, it's a horrible thing. It really is. It's awful. We hate it. Bad Israel, bad United States.
Right. Well, again, there are a lot of countries that have taken strong stances, but they just haven't backed it up. And again, I think you really have to, if you're going to point your finger to any country, you need to point it to the neighboring countries like Turkey and Egypt and Jordan. First of all, they are the neighboring countries. And second, they are co-religionists. These are Sunni countries. They, above all, have a responsibility to deal with this. And we know that they haven't. Now, Turkey was really particularly is in a position to do something. I think Jordan and Egypt are much weaker. But Turkey, could have cut off that oil. You can say, yeah, okay, they had this contract and whatever, but these are exceptional circumstances. They could have, and could have really cut off trade. They could have done things that really would have hurt Israel, and they just didn't. Under Erdogan, they didn't. And a lot of Turks are upset about that. So, I mean, if you're going to blame any countries, I think you got to point to those countries first and foremost. And then, we have this so-called peace plan, in effect, that was actually approved by the Security Council. Why was it approved by the Security Council? Why didn't Russia and China cast dissenting votes? They both abstained. Russia proposed an alternative, which would have been much fairer, and really was based on international law, but they didn't get the support. And again, this is what the Russians themselves point out. They didn't get support from those neighboring countries, not just the ones that I mentioned, but also the Persian Gulf states and whatever. And say, well, if you people yourselves won't do anything, how can you expect us to save them? I still wish they would. I mean, for example, China obviously has huge economic power. Again, they've been very, very clear, in their denunciations of Israel, but they haven't backed it up, and it's not the way Chinese do things, but I wish that they would in this case. This is so exceptional, and I think they would actually make China much more popular around the world. They did it.
Right. Yeah, it's something that I think I mentioned before is that from what the U.S. and Israel have done over the past couple of years, and really if we go back further, just the moral capital of the United States has been extinguished. There is a moral vacuum in the world right now. And so it's an opportunity for these countries like China to step up and take a moral stance and say, no, this is wrong. And the world will be behind it. And that will do immense good for any country's soft power that takes that position. So to me, it makes sense to do it. And it also, we can potentially just avoid a catastrophic war and the use of a nuclear weapon. Right. If we sanction a country like Israel, if China does cut off trade, says no more rare earths, and doing it to the United States as well. I mean, it's funny because there's always these accusations being pointed towards China saying how they're the ones keeping Russia in the fight, supplying all these components and all these things. When the reality is China does this for everybody, including the United States. So China is really propping up. And Ukraine, right. Because China makes everything. So really China has the biggest cards to play. And so they ironically are really propping up the U.S. empire because the U.S. empire relies on China almost completely relies on it. I won't say how much, but I mean, we know, I think, was it like 50% of the components for the U.S. military actually come from China. So and the rare earths, those are
Right.
necessary for all of our high-end weapons manufacturing and high tech here. Those all come from China. They hold all the cards. They could bring it down without a war, or maybe that
Yeah.
would trigger a war. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that may be the risk, but um, yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. And I would even say with Russia, I kind of wonder, I'm not sure, but, we have a lot of criticism of Putin. He's so moderate. He's always kind of, again, trying to, you know, almost pretend that he has a friendship with the United States, and that, when the reality is that the U.S. is attacking him every day, right? And maybe that's the right policy. Again, he's trying not to escalate. He knows he can win this war. He doesn't want it to expand. He doesn't want to provoke Trump. So he may be right about all that. But I can see the other side of it. It's just speak with clarity. And I think that, especially in this time where the U.S., there's this obvious moral collapse, as you just mentioned, in the U.S. and the West in general, certainly Europe as well. There's this obvious moral collapse. It's a chance for Russia and China really to seize the banner, of moral civilization and say, this is who we are and we oppose this unequivocally. No, and in some senses they're doing it, but at the same time, they're kind of muddying the waters. I think they're proceeding maybe too cautiously. But again, we're talking about a potential for war. Maybe they have to do that.
Right.
But they're the two countries that really can, because the thing is, when you talk about other countries, including Iran, or Venezuela, and we see what happened to Venezuela, because Venezuela was very, very open about its opposition to Western hegemony and its opposition to Zionism, and its ties with Russia and China. And you see what happened, right? And we see what Iran is being subjected to right now, right? So any country, a smaller country that goes really out on a limb, does risk something. They say you'll be the next sanctioned country, and then there's going to be a fleet off of your shore, and so a lot of countries think twice. But Russia and China can. They're the two countries that really can do this and survive, and maybe I'd argue thrive if they. Maybe I would hope would thrive. I know there's risk involved in taking this approach.
Yeah, well, I would just say, I think Yemen is the example for countries that they have shown that they could stand up to this power, and they are treated as heroes, rightly so.
But they've also been, they suffered a decapitation strike. Much of their leadership has been killed. A lot of facilities, hospitals, and so on have been destroyed. They have suffered the consequences.
True.
But again, they were so poor already that they didn't have all that much to lose, which is
they're already at the bottom.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you just think about the moral standing of these countries like Yemen and Iran, 5 years ago, people would they would be, these are bad countries. Now, the majority of the world is like, these guys are the ones that are standing up. These are brave people, men and women that are fighting for, the right for resistance and the right to live, just fighting for these
sovereignty, and then and opposing genocide, right?
Right, opposing genocide. That's why is it so hard to get everybody on board with this? It's really ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay, well, is there anything else we want to talk about regarding the Middle East? Well, one last thing. Are we moving? I saw something. We're moving to phase 2. Is that actually happening?
That's one thing I wanted to mention. Trump, the Trump administration has announced that they're moving to phase 2, which would mean the establishment of an international stabilization force. It would also mean disarmament of Hamas. And it would mean withdrawal, from the yellow line. The Israelis would have to retreat farther. All of those things would happen. And okay, I guess also the creation of what they call a Palestinian technocratic committee. That's sort of it would be a committee that oversees really the reconstruction of Gaza. So we're dealing with you can say technical humanitarian issues, what to do with the rubble, how to start the rebuilding, repair the desalination plants and the hospitals and everything that has been destroyed. And they have chosen somebody, I think a Palestinian living in Egypt, if I'm correct, to head this commission, but they haven't named the other people. And I think, they also mentioned there's some Bulgarian who's supposed to be the head of the peace board or something. Or he would be under Trump, but I think he would be the guy under Trump. But I think, he has a history of being very closely aligned with the Zionists. Now, okay, that all sounds maybe encouraging. Maybe it is. But the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, has essentially kind of dismissed it and said, oh, that's just symbolic. In other words, they have no intention of retreating. I don't think, they were fine with the first phase, again, getting the hostages back above all, but they got to keep, more than half of the land, and they have actually been expanding that. They've been moving the yellow line, as they always do. They always play these games. Everything, we've mentioned all the violations. Well over 400. We're approaching 500 have been killed, about a third of them children. These happen every day. And they destroy homes too. They've been destroying thousands of homes on both sides of the yellow line. So they have, they got something out of the first phase. They didn't really keep their side of the bargain, except that they slowed down, they ended the ground offensive and they slowed down the bombing. So they're, instead of killing dozens a day, they're killing a few people every day. That's what's happening. But they don't want to go. They don't want to go to phase two. They don't want to give up territory. They don't want to have an international force in Gaza because they want Gaza. The only part of it they like is the Hamas handing over its arms, and Hamas has actually said that they're willing to do that if Israel keeps its side of the bargain and actually does withdraw. It complies with all with its obligations. But the Israelis just won't. So I don't see it going anywhere. And again, essentially they waved it off. Netanyahu and his people. Oh, it's just symbolic. They're not going anywhere.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as always, it seems like this is just the temporary pause, and we're going to see what's going to happen next in the Middle East. I mean, with Iran, there's so many things with Gaza, right. Also Somaliland. There's something else cooking.
Yeah. Well,
Israel
one thing also.
Stop.
Yeah. Well, one thing I just wanted to mention, because before we leave the Middle East, it was also reported that one of the reasons that Trump chose not to launch the attack, the other day, was that the Israelis actually requested for more time. They were afraid of what would happen to them. And so I think their idea said, well, maybe they want the U.S. assets, and the reason partly to provide them defense. That's because remember, it wasn't just Israeli air defense. It was also U.S. air defense. Now, I think they're really, even together, they're insufficient, but they want as much air defense as they can possibly get. So apparently Netanyahu said, maybe we shouldn't do this now. They could hit us really hard and we can't do much about it.
Yeah, I saw some report, I don't know if it's true, that Iran and Israel kind of communicated via Russia that they won't hit each other, that basically that this was the U.S. is doing this alone, that Israel's staying out of it even though.
I think that's believable. That was something that I think I mentioned in the last episode, is that Israel, probably won't be directly involved in this. If it had happened yesterday, they would try to keep out of it because they don't want to be hit. And they say, oh, nothing to do with us. And, but clearly at the same time, we're getting these statements about Mossad and whatever. I think I don't think that they're hoping not to be hit, but maybe they did work something out like that with the Iranians. It's believable. These things do happen, even between the bitterest enemies.
That's so crazy then if Israel would get a stay out of it, potentially, if that's what they made, and that the U.S. has to do it all. And why us? Because Israel told us to do it.
Right.
That's why.
No. It's just we're concerned about human rights and
right.
innocent protesters. That's why we do things.
Clearly. Okay, well, let's move over to Greenland just real quick. Is this a big story? Could this for me, it seems kind of silly and funny, the whole thing about Greenland. But then I'm thinking that potentially this could be a huge event because it could maybe turn the Europeans against the Americans. And this could also help break the empire.
Right. Well, yeah, it's both of those things. It's ridiculous, it's silly, and it's also potentially history making. It's all these things at the same time. Well, it is silly because there's absolutely no need for us to take Greenland. The only thing that you could, if you're looking at U.S. interests, is that maybe we would get these mineral rights, which could be quite significant. But that's not, maybe that's the ulterior motive. But what the stated motive is security. And look, it's part of NATO. And we already have a base there. We've had dozens of bases in the past. We could simply request or basically demand, additional bases, and Denmark would immediately say, sure, whatever. The security argument doesn't make a bit of sense. It just doesn't make a bit of sense. So it's the thing, and it's just silly. It's just ridiculous. One thing I actually just learned the other day, the person that suggested this idea of taking over Greenland to Trump was a very interesting character named Ronald Lauder. It was the heir to the Estee Lauder fortune. And you look at this one guy, he's connected to all these different, geopolitical hotspots. He just the other day, I noticed his name because he is on the board of this consortium that was awarded a contract to exploit the largest lithium deposit in Ukraine. It's in central Ukraine. He was part of this mineral deal. So he's there, but he was the guy who back in 2019 suggested this whole thing. Yeah, why don't you take over Greenland? And he's also an avid, fervid Zionist, very close to Likud. He was the head of the World Jewish Congress. And in that capacity, he met Putin back in 2016. He does have business interests in Russia, too. So anyway, it's just one of these globalist kind of characters there that you run across. And then, yeah, he's involved in this. So, there, and I hear there is I think already some sort of company has been created that involves Bill Gates and other, Jeff Bezos and, these other, oligarchs basically, to exploit mineral resources in Greenland. So, maybe that's part of what's going on. That's the only thing that would sort of make sense, right? But the cost of it would be huge, because it's an attack on NATO. This is really quite extraordinary. Well, but the thing is, I wouldn't say this is the first attack on NATO. The first one was Nord Stream. And in a way that was even bigger, but it's been kept hidden and they're trying to do whatever they can to obfuscate it. But here's a second very open attack. And this is obviously going to put NATO under tremendous strain. I mean, I don't think there's actually going to be any fighting. It might, it seems like it's probably going to happen, that Trump's really dead set on doing it. And if he really wants it to happen, I think it will. There's just no way that the Greenland and the tiny little forces that the Europeans are sending over there are going to prevent him from taking it if he wants to. And then, look, there are only 57,000 people there, and he could just pay them off, They're talking, I was thinking you give each 100,000, that's less than $6 billion, but they're talking about $700 billion, I don't know, maybe paying off the Europeans or whatever. That's a lot of money, actually, even for us. That's a lot of money. So we're either going to just buy it, or get it through bribery, or we'll just take it, with our military, and it completely unnecessary. And will have tremendous consequences. It's obviously, I don't know that will be the end of NATO, but it will be certainly the beginning of the hollowing out of NATO. It may just exist on paper. You just say, wait a second, it's not Russia that's attacking us. It's the United States. And people maybe will start to look back at Nord Stream and talk about that and say, well, this is a second attack. And I guess at the same time, I kind of find the whole thing sort of funny because there really is no huge humanitarian issue here. Like in Iran, okay, if this attack happens, the Iranian people could really suffer. There's a danger of a wider regional war that could even go nuclear. This is really scary. There's nothing scary about Greenland. It's just stupid. And, probably nobody's going to get hurt. The Greenlanders will probably make off like bandits. they'll lose their cradle to grave health care, but they'll each have $100,000 at least. And, that's the American way, I suppose.
Yeah, it's just interesting because the Europeans have painted Putin as this imperialist, that he is just going around and he wants to just grab territory. But I mean, let's just look at things objectively.
Yeah.
Who is the imperialist?
Right, yeah.
It's the United States. We're invading, Venezuela. We're carrying out strikes all over the world, bombing Nigeria one day, and then in the Middle East the next day. And then we tell our allies that we're going to just take Greenland, this huge landmass that belongs to Denmark, because for national security, when they're like, wait, if you need to put military bases there, you already have one anyways, and you're part of NATO, so we can just do that anyways. There's no reason to just take it. So I think that narrative, of just Putin as this unprovoked, imperialist is just going to start to people. They can't hold these two thoughts in their head at the same time. Yeah. U.S. good, actually taking Greenland, and then right. the Russia, horrible. And like you said, there's just so much ammunition for the Europeans, if they want to turn on America, that will resonate with their populations, with their citizenry. Like you mentioned, the Nord Stream. I was just watching this clip again. And I was trying to download it and put it, but I couldn't get it up here. Maybe next time I'll have it. But it was just where Biden specifically says, he's standing up there in a press conference. He's like, if Russia invades, we will end Nord Stream. We will end it. And the reporter just says, how are you going to do that? That's Germany. And he said, we will end it.
Yeah.
Definitively.
Yeah.
And so just the Europeans need to see that again. Yeah, it needs to be on mainstream media in Europe over and over again saying, who is really attacking you? America's taking Greenland. America destroyed your economy by blowing up the infrastructure here. NATO expansion. This is a U.S. foreign policy that your country has decided to adopt just recently.
Yeah, because
10, 15 years ago, you were against it.
Right.
And so all of this, everything that's happening now, is because of America. And you can put out that messaging and it will resonate because it's true. And the truth resonates with people when they hear it. It's just so many people in Europe have been fed these convoluted, confusing narratives of why things are happening. And it's Russia's fault, it's China's fault, it's North Korea, Iran, the mullahs. And and it's like, I guess maybe that makes sense. It's so complicated. I guess so. But then once they hear the truth and they see Biden saying these things directly from his mouth, they will understand. And then it's over. And then you have this huge geopolitical rift, that's like, you know what? And we're already seeing it happen because there's so much hatred towards Trump from amongst some of these leaders, like Canada. I mean, the president, I forget, don't even remember the guy's name, whatever, but he's been talking to China more and realizing that, okay, the U.S. is not our friend. China is actually honors their agreements and they want to do business and they can benefit your country.
Right.
So just be rational. Right. We see the way that Trump is acting. One day he might give you $40 billion of your Argentina for your beef. And the next day he might just slap a 50% tariff on our country, or he might just decide to bomb you, or he might just kidnap your leader. It's like, who knows?
Right. Well, we saw something similar. You mentioned Canada and how it's turning to China. The same thing's happening in India. That Trump slapped the punitive tariffs on them, and actually since then, since the relations with the U.S. started to go sour, the Indians have turned strongly towards China, and their trade with China is really taking off. And it just makes perfect sense. You say, why? In the end, we can get everything we need from China. And without having to pay these costs, the political humiliation, the economic costs, we don't have to suffer any of that.
So do you think that there is a chance that as things progress, and if the U.S. really does take Greenland, that we could see the Europeans actually turn on the Americans, because if they realize as well that this war in Ukraine can't be won, and it's destroying us, let's shift all the blame on the Americans and end this madness and cut a deal with the Russians and learn how to live with them. And then the animosity sort of just pivots towards the United States. And maybe the Ukrainians themselves will realize, like, hey, we were lied to. Everybody's dead and our country's destroyed. And it's because the U.S. promised us that, this huge, I don't know.
Well, maybe one day you don't see it happening anytime soon. You still, the Europeans and the Ukrainians are still adamant. They have not really changed their position, by a single iota. But like you say, at some point, reality, I think, has a way of winning out, and it's going to become increasingly hard to maintain this position over time. Both because of Russian advances, but also because of American behavior.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's move over to Russia-Ukraine. But before we do that, do you think you want to close your blinds a bit because I can see the light?
Yeah, the sun just came out. I'm sorry. Yes,
it's going to cover your face pretty soon.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Okay. So let's start with, I've heard that Putin has been pretty quiet recently, and now he's not so quiet. I've been following what's going on with Ukraine. Is there some big change in policy or stance that's happening here, or is it?
No obvious change yet. Maybe there's one coming, but no obvious change. Yeah, he was very quiet, but that may just be because we had the New Year's and Christmas in Russia, and that's a time when people take time off, even the president to some extent. But he's back, and meeting with military and civilian officials, and we don't see any dramatic change. There's some speculation that there's been a lot of debate behind the scenes. Again, Putin is really the moderate here. The cautious, go slow, let's appease the Americans guy, but most of the leadership is maybe more in the Medvedev camp. Let's just forget, drop this pretense. This is nonsense. They're our enemies, and let's treat them as such. But we don't see any dramatic changes yet.
Okay. Well, you were saying that the political situation in Ukraine, though, might be changing.
Well, yeah, it's really quite interesting. I just think it's quite revealing. There have been many personnel changes following the dismissal of Yermak, who was regarded as the number 2 man. Sometimes people even said he was number 1. He was, he became the object of these investigations by the anti-corruption agencies. And there's a lot of, talk, maybe this was the Americans were doing this to pressure the Ukrainians to, actually to, submit or agree to their peace plan. I don't see any evidence of that. I don't think that was ever true. First of all, these anti-corruption agencies are now much closer to the Europeans, and the people that staff them are liberal internationalists who hate Trump, and I don't think and also who hate the peace plan, they're like the most pro-war faction in all of Ukraine. This is, it's maybe counterintuitive, but maybe it shouldn't be. Like, the Greens in Germany are the most pro-war. So times have changed. I remember when the Greens were the peaceniks, and anyway, that's the distant past. That's the new reality. Is the liberals are the hawks, and it's very, very true in Ukraine. So anyway, they did manage to get rid of Yermak. And exactly why that is, there are all kinds of theories. I think, partly, they really, in general, Yermak was very, very unpopular. He was especially unpopular with these liberal nationalists, but also with the Europeans, the Americans, with all kinds of people, both in Ukraine and in among the supporting countries. So he's gone, but yet he's not gone. Remember, he said he was going to go to the front lines, and that never happened. I don't think anybody was shocked by that. He's still there in Kyiv, and apparently he meets with Zelensky every day. He's still, it wasn't really his office that gave him the power. It was his personal connections. And those personal connections, haven't disappeared. So he's still a major player. I think he's dropped a notch. as a result of this. But he's still there. He's still exerting influence. Now, he was replaced by Bodunov, right? The former head of the GUR, the military intelligence. And this guy, quite a character, sociopath, somebody who just clearly, like he openly said, just enjoys killing Russians. And likes the dark. That's what he told, he likes to be interviewed in the dark. I like the dark. His background, he came out of the neo-Nazi soccer hooligan scene in Odessa. That's where he comes from. But now, to his credit, he has shown himself to be more realistic over, especially the last year. He's been saying, look, we're losing this war. Maybe that's because, in charge of military intelligence, he's really very well informed about it. And we need to negotiate, and the weaker party cannot set the terms. He actually said all those things, which is quite remarkable. And now he's, the head of this, of Zelensky's office. He's what we would call the chief of staff. Now, that position doesn't give him tremendous power. Again, Yermak had tremendous power because he was Yermak. And now, why is Bodunov in there? I've heard like a half a dozen theories, and I'm not going to go through them. I would just say that it wasn't Zelensky's first choice. He would rather have Yermak still there, but he was pressured, and he had to let go of him. Yermak was unpopular. Bodunov is actually more popular, quite a bit more popular within Ukraine. But he also has independent, or people believe he has independent political ambitions. So some people say that, Zelensky put him there so he can keep an eye on him, and actually it'd be easier for him to control him. So who knows? Anyway, but he's there. He's also supposed to have very good connections with the CIA. That's another thing. But he's no longer the head of military intelligence. So we'll see what that may have actually reduced the CIA's influence. But it's hard to say. Now, there have been other personnel changes, quite a few, and it's hard to look at and say a real clear picture. I think it just comes down to Zelensky trying to, maintain his hold on power, making certain compromises where he needs to, but then also, shuffling people around in a way that he feels will actually, keep him in power for the foreseeable future. And one very interesting change is, he got rid of the head of the SBU, Malyuk. And I think everybody in Ukraine agrees that he did that because Malyuk let him down last fall. Remember when the anti-corruption protests occurred? He was trying to shut down those agencies because they were going after his friends and allies. And then he was forced to retreat. Well, he had told the SBU basically, arrest those guys, meaning the anti-corruption people. And Malyuk disobeyed orders. He didn't do it. So ever since, Zelensky has been looking for a chance to get rid of him. Now he has gotten rid of him. And he's replaced him with some guy named, I think it's Kamar or something like that. He's not all that interesting, but then also a deputy. There's the deputy director of the SBU, which is the main, the secret service, the main security service within Ukraine. Now, this person has a very interesting past, kind of like Budanov. He, back in the 1990s, he actually joined a police force. I believe it was in Poltava in central Ukraine. And he actually joined the anti-organized crime unit. Then like 6 months later, he was arrested for working for organized crime. He was sentenced to 6 years. That was later commuted to 2.5 years. And then once he gets out, what does he do? He immediately gets employment with organized crime. And he was with the organized crime for, for the next decade. And during that time, he was actually hitman for them. And he developed a reputation for being particularly brutal. He has the nickname the Strangler, because apparently he liked to, these victims or detainees of the organized crime, he would personally strangle. And he said, people said, these are the stories anyway, that they gave him a great deal of pleasure. And during that time, though, it's like he worked very closely with police forces, with the courts. And, it just seems like this is Ukraine that we're talking about. And he also made a friend named Yermak around 2010. And then he got, not too long afterwards, employment with the SBU, and he's, worked his way up. He was the head of the assassination unit at one time in the SBU, and now he's the deputy director. So anyway, I just think it's very revealing. It's just, this is Ukraine. This is the Ukrainian government. These are the kind of people at the top. I mean, this is, you find, people say, oh, they're very dark aspects to Russian society. I think you can say any society. There are dark corners there, and you can find them in Russia. But in Russia, they're being, with every passing year under Putin, those dark corners are getting smaller and smaller. We've talked about that they have their own ultra-nationalist, unit, but they keep it on a tight leash and it's pretty small. In Ukraine, we have the Third Army Corps. It's huge. It's just like they're basically those people are running the show in the military anyway in Ukraine. And then you look at these organized crime, and we're not talking about just any kind of organized crime, but the most brutal kind of organized crime. And these are the people they rise to the top. That is the Zelensky regime.
Oof, that's scary.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, to think that your country is being run by these type of people. I mean, and that's why it's, we laugh at Lindsey Graham, but that's what, that's also just a symptom of scary. Just like you have these bad men, and somehow that are not representative of what men are normally like. This is an anomaly. This is like 0.1% most evil people, but somehow in our systems they seem to rise to the top.
Yeah,
or definitely in Ukraine they are.
Yeah. Well, ours is a combination. We seems like the most incompetent, and then the most power hungry. That's the problem with politics in general, is it attracts people who are power hungry, right? That's the occupational hazard. And you can see the consequences. Again, in Ukraine, it's like the 1990s never really ended. The 1990s Russia was, so much of society was run basically by organized crime. And that has been changing. It didn't happen overnight, but once Putin took power, it just sort of, bit by bit, he's been moving Russia away from that. The victory isn't total. There's still aspects of the society, where you still see a little bit of the 1990s still there. But in Ukraine, it never left. And if anything, it seems to have gotten worse.
Do you see Ukraine holding on much longer? Will they make it through the winter? I mean, what is the situation right now?
Yeah, well, it's become very grim for the civilians, in places like Kyiv. I mean, it's really, again, they're in the midst of winter, and most of them are without power. They only get power for, if many of them haven't had power for days. Others get power for just a couple of hours a day. It really makes life very difficult for them. And people are suffering. And this is something new. I mean, I'm not quite sure what the Russian plan is. One possibility is that they are planning actually to take Kyiv. And so they do want people to leave Kyiv. Again, the mayor has said, if you got a place to go, just leave. Look, we can't take care of you here now. Zelensky is very upset about that, but I think the Klitschko was just telling them the truth. Very recently, the Russians have begun to make some moves where they haven't moved before. I mean, they're very small moves, but they have crossed the borders in places like Belgorod and Sumy, or the Chernigov region, which is directly north of Kyiv. In locations that are, put them on roads to Kyiv, let's say. And these are very small moves now, but it may be but everything begins small, or quite often big operations begin small. And maybe that's what we're seeing, is that this is part of a plan to take Kyiv. I don't know, but I'm just going to throw that out there as a possibility.
Yeah. Also, if the power is out in Kyiv, I imagine, people are suffering. Is this kind of maybe a playbook as well to have the people turn against their government, say, end this war? We can't win this. This needs to stop. Do you think that's also a possibility?
It might be. One thing is, like, for the longest time, the Russians really hadn't done anything to Kyiv. There, occasional strikes and so on and so forth. But Kyiv was relatively untouched until just, the last few months. And this is where the power is concentrated. And you still had this, maybe they're just observing this tremendous arrogance, the sense of confidence. They always got those stupid, country bumpkins. Those are the ones who are being sent to the front. It wasn't the rich and well-connected Kievans who ever had to pay, and they were living comfortably there in Kiev, and now the war is coming home to them. So maybe that's part of what's going on. I really don't know. But then also another thing to point out is that, again, electricity is, as the Americans themselves have admitted and many others have admitted over the years and decades, is dual use. And so it's not just civilian homes that aren't heated, but it's also, drone manufacturing plants and so on that are not able to run.
Okay. Are we seeing any much movement on the battlefront right now, on the front lines?
Well, it slowed down for a while. And again, that may have been a combination of weather and the holiday season. And it seems to be picking up again. Now, one thing is I just saw actually a graph that shows the advances. If you compare last year, 2025, to the previous year, 2024, there clearly more territory was taken last year. But overall, not maybe, I'll just make a guess, 30% more, 40%. So it's not a huge increase, a huge acceleration, but an acceleration. Now, towards the end of the year, though, there really wasn't much a difference. If you compare, let's say, fall of 2024 to fall of 2025, it's about the same in terms of total square kilometers. However, there's a huge qualitative difference. It's just that in the fall of 2024, the Russians were basically taking fields and small, towns or settlements, really, villages. In 2025, okay, they take the same amount of territory, but a lot of that was urban territory. They took Pokrovsk, they took Mirnograd, they took Seversk, which was, again, a real small town, but very, very important, a real fortress town. And they took a big chunk of Konstantinovka. They took a big chunk of Kupiansk. The Ukrainians counterattacked there, but still, it looks like the Russians have most of Kupiansk and are slowly pushing back against those counterattacks. So even though you see at the fall, there wasn't a change, any big difference in terms of total area taken between 2024 and 2025. There's a qualitative difference. You're taking major, towns, real fortresses. And so I think overall you compare 2024 to 2025 and you see that it was, the Russians did a lot more in 2025 than they did in 2024. And the Ukrainians did a lot less. I think the only success, if you want to call it that the Ukrainians had was a counterattack in Kupiansk where they managed to push back the Russians in the western part of the town, but they haven't been able to actually consolidate those gains. It's basically a gray zone, if I understand correctly, in western Kupiansk, and the Russians will end up taking it. So that's all that they had to show as far as, their counterattacks or counteroffenses, which is a big contrast from previous years, including 2024, when they did Kursk.
Is there a realization now coming amongst European leaders that this war can't be won? I saw something about Macron saying that we got to talk to Putin now. Like,
yeah.
Is there some change or not really?
Yeah, I don't know. Macron says these things every once in a while, but he usually doesn't follow up on it. Meloni's also saying that they need to talk to him. You see hints, kind of like asides, I think it was the president of Czechoslovakia said something similar. The Merz made a very interesting comment. Merz is again, we know he's almost like the Lindsey Graham of Germany, as far as I can tell, but with a real, let's say, Nazi look about him. But he was speaking about this coalition of the willing plan. The French and the British were going to send these troops. And he said, basically, this doesn't mean anything because the Russians have to agree to it. And that was, well, kind of surprising coming from Mertz, but I think it's happening. This realism, this acknowledgement of the realities is growing, but very gradually, and it still hasn't caused them to make any significant changes in their policies or their approach to the war. They're still on the same track. We got to support Ukraine. We got to send them arms. We got to send them money. But they're having trouble doing it, even just sending the money. As we know, there was that big struggle to steal the frozen Russian assets. That didn't work out. And then they worked out something else. But it's not clear that that's, it's just going to fall short. It's not going to be nearly enough.
Yeah, well, it feels like Ukraine can't hang on that much longer. I mean, we're talking about Kyiv is having trouble keeping the lights on, and the mayor Klitschko is saying, leave. And we're talking about getting close to evacuating the capital, or, and the same thing I imagine people in Odessa and Kharkiv. At some point, if they're not having any power and they're getting hit hard, and it looks like the Russians are going to take these cities, there's an evacuation order. It's over. It's over, right?
Yeah,
I just feel like we got to be getting
I think
close.
It clearly is. I mean, anybody who's being realistic about it say, yeah, you're losing, you will lose. And again, the smart thing to do is just accept the deal that the Russians have on the table. I don't think it's going to be on the table much longer. But it would be the smart thing to do, but it's just politically impossible. It's not something, because of the ultra nationalists and the liberal nationalists or whatever, they would just probably literally murder Zelensky if he tried to do it at this point. So what I just repeat what I said earlier. Actually, when the Russians do take Donbass, they do take the four oblasts. At that point, that may be the last chance for a deal if the Russians are willing to make one at that point. Right? They would.
Probably not.
Yeah, because maybe at that point, the Ukrainians will be so weak that the Russians will just say, we have them completely on the ropes. We'll take Odessa. We know that we need it because they've been using it to launch all these attacks on us. So just forget it. It's too late. You guys had your chance, But at that point, the Ukrainians might say, okay, we'll stop now because now the ceasefire line is the four oblasts plus these so-called buffer zones. But it may be too late for the Ukrainians at that point.
Yeah, I predict that as we end up with a rout and a true collapse on our hands, that the blame will be shifted over to the United States, and rightly so. I think, and the Europeans will need a scapegoat if they realize that they just cannot go to war with Russia, even though they're talking about it constantly. It's just they don't have the capacity or the ability and that hard constraint. The only political out I can see for these people is to shift the blame to the United States. And it's pretty easy when the United States is saying we're going to invade Greenland and we're on video saying we blew up your pipeline. There's a lot of stuff to be angry about, and I think that's the only way that this will go, and this will just lead to further isolation of the United States. I don't know how long it'll play out, but the truth will prevail eventually. And when all this death and destruction is over, people will look around and say, why the hell did this happen? And we're going to have to look at the U.S. You
may be right. One thing is how much will they be able to just pin this all on Trump? Well, obviously they can't for Nord Stream, right? That's Biden. But they will try to pin it all on Trump. And then hope that a Democrat will come in power and everything will be fine again. I'm sure that many of them are hoping that. I just don't know that that's going to happen. We'll see, or they can wait that long. Or even if a Democrat came in, if things would really change that much. Again, people are always surprised. They assume that, they're going to reverse these things. Like, Biden was going to reinstate the JCPOA and would ease tensions with China. Nothing changed. It was like Trump set the course in his first term, and then Biden continued it. And maybe Greenland would be an exception and say, that was, because this is perhaps if the Democrats took power, they would say, we're going to reverse this, but maybe not. I think there's a good chance they wouldn't. They say, now it's ours. We'll just keep it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there's a lot happening. Things are changing so fast. I feel like this is just history in the making that we're just living through. The biggest events probably in the past, would you say potential. Well, I don't know. I don't want to compare to World War One, World War Two, but just
Yeah.
in terms of Western dominance of the world, that's been 500 years, and it's ending right now. We're watching it collapse in real time.
I think it's fair to say, this is the end of coming to the end of a long, period of Western dominance. And then, we also are seeing, the end of the post-World War II order. That seemed so stable not too long ago. It's obviously no longer stable. You can just see the cracks everywhere in the foundations.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay, well, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Okay.
Just want to say, if you made it to the end, you should try checking out our Substack as well. I haven't really been pushing it much, but I think it's really quite good. We summarize this whole hour-long podcast that we do, and even myself, I enjoy reading it. It's summarized very well. We add little images and image assets and videos as well to accompany it. So it's a good debriefing. If you don't have time to listen to the whole hour, you can get it all summed up very nicely in a 5-minute read. So check it out. It'll be linked in the below. And also, subscribe to the new channel if you want to help get that one started, and like, comment, and subscribe, all that stuff if you would like to indicate that fact, as Alexander McCurry says. So. Okay, we'll end it there. All right, Dad. All right. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.